The explosion came from the East Tower. Not a rocket, not ordnance, something internal. A relay capacitor that had been holding too long, finally giving up. The shock wave rolled across the tarmac like a dry wave. Shards of oxidized steel rained down on runway 4 in a sound like broken wind chimes. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter didn't flinch. She was already on her scope. "Donovan." Her voice was flat, controlled. "Relays spiking. Someone's pushing a reroute signal through the secondary uplink." Static. Then, "How long?" 30 seconds before it locks the civilian GPS subnet. She swept the optic left. Movement near the fuel depot. A shadow that knew how to be a shadow. "And we've got company. Train company." She found her shot. 900 meters. Wind at her left cheek, steady as a held breath. Her finger rested on the trigger guard. Take it now. But if she fired, the muzzle flash would trigger the pressure sensor on the relay coupling. 30 seconds. The civilian convoy on Route 93 would lose navigation in the Nevada dark. One shot, one choice. Cut to black. The spaceport had a name once. Artemis Launch Facility, Nevada. Commissioned in 2019 as a joint venture between the U.S. Army Space and Missile Defense Command and a private aerospace consortium called Helios Dynamics. The press called it the future. Senators gave speeches on the tarmac. There were photographs of generals shaking hands with men in expensive suits. That lasted 4 years. Then the contracts dried up. Then the lawsuit started. Then the Army quietly handed the keys back to Helios, who promptly mothballed the facility and stopped returning calls from the Pentagon. 3 launch pads, 2 hangars the size of aircraft carriers, a control tower still packed with electronics that no one had bothered to strip, because stripping them would mean acknowledging they existed. Now it was just a place where the wind moved. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter had been here 9 days. She sat in the old flight operations booth on level 3 of the control tower. Her Mark 22 rifle laid across a shooting bag she'd fashioned from sandbags and duct tape. The window glass had been removed. She'd done that herself on day 1, because glass distorted sight pictures and created reflections that could give away a position. Now the Nevada air came straight through, carrying its load of fine grit and dry heat, and she breathed it like she breathed everything, slowly, deliberately, without complaint. The sun was 3 hours from setting. The desert floor below shimmered. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch actual to relay base, status." The response came through slightly clipped, the satellite link showing the usual afternoon degradation. "Relay base copies, all systems nominal. Uplink to Navstar holding at 94%. No anomalous traffic detected in the last 6 hours." "Copy that." She didn't move her eye from the scope. "What about the civilian transit window?" Route 93 convoy clears the perimeter at 2100. 16 vehicles, mostly private contractors heading to the Tonopah test range. They'll be in our GPS coverage zone for approximately 40 minutes. Understood. She clicked off and returned to her scan. The mission brief had been straightforward enough, on paper. Artemis facility still housed the Relay Alpha terminal, a hardened data node that served as a backup routing point for Navstar military GPS signals across the Southwest. 4 states' worth of precision navigation ran through this box during contingency operations. The Army didn't advertise its existence. Neither did Helios Dynamics, who technically owned the building around it. Someone had been probing the relay's external access ports for 3 weeks. Emily's job was to find out who, and to ensure they didn't succeed. She'd done harder assignments. She reminded herself of that when the silence got heavy. The satellite phone buzzed at 15:47 hours. Not the tactical radio, the phone, which meant it was Donovan. She picked it up without looking away from the scope. "Carter. You eat today?" Master Sergeant Jack Donovan, retired, currently operating as a civilian contractor and Overwatch advisor for this operation, which meant he sat in an air-conditioned trailer 18 miles east at Tonopah and reviewed her sensor feeds and generally acted like a man who had not actually retired. "I ate," she said. "What did you eat?" "Calories." A pause. "That's not an answer." It answered the question. She heard him exhale. That particular exhale she had cataloged over 14 months of working with him. The one that meant, "I'm not going to argue this point, but I am noting it for later." Donovan had been a Marine Scout sniper for 22 years, 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan before a truck bomb near Kandahar took 3 of his fingers, and his willingness to keep doing it for a paycheck. He consulted now, trained now, watched feeds and read weather data, and occasionally said things that turned out to be exactly right. He was 62 years old, and he saw more through a sensor feed than most people saw standing in the open. "Winds picking up from the southwest," she said. "Gusts at 11, 12 miles per hour. Thermals off the runway surface are creating vertical drift I have to account for." "At what range?" "Everything past 700. Anything past 850. I'm adding a half-mil correction and hoping." "Don't hope. Calculate." "I always calculate, then I hope." Another exhale. But this one had a different quality, something that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "Sensor package on pad 2 is showing intermittent signal. Could be the hardware degrading, could be something else." "I saw it. I'm watching pad 2. "Good." She waited. Donovan didn't call on the satellite phone for small talk. Or at least, he didn't used to. In the last year, she'd noticed the calls had become slightly longer. She didn't analyze it too deeply. "This place," he said finally, "you know what it reminds me of?" "Don't." "I'm just saying, you can feel it. A place that was supposed to matter and then didn't." "Donovan." "Yeah, I need to focus." "You're always focused. That's not always the same as being present." She had no response to that. She filed it in the same mental drawer as everything else he said that she wasn't ready to examine yet. "I'll call it 1800, she said. "If the sensor package on pad 2 degrades further, I want a technician assessment before morning." "Already requested. Good night, Carter." "It's not night." "It will be." He clicked off. She returned to her scan. The first anomaly appeared at 17:12 hours. 2 figures crossing the open ground between Hangar B and the fuel depot complex, moving in the long shadow of the hangar wall, which told her they understood basic fieldcraft. Stay in shadow, minimize thermal signature, don't cross open ground in direct sun. That wasn't civilian contractor behavior. Contractors took the road. Contractors didn't think about shadows. She tracked them on the scope. Male, both of them. Tactical clothing but deliberately nondescript. The kind of gear you could buy off the internet. One carried a hard-sided Pelican equipment case. The other moved empty-handed, weight slightly forward, hands loose at his sides. "Ready hands." She noted it. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch actual to relay base. 2 unscheduled personnel crossing the Hangar B perimeter. Confirm any authorized maintenance at the fuel depot?" "Negative, Overwatch. No scheduled activity at the fuel depot until 0700 tomorrow." "Copy." She kept the scope on them. She pushed the visual now. She pushed the image through the encrypted feed to Donovan's trailer. 12 seconds. Then, "I see them." His voice had shifted, the warmth gone. This was the other voice, flatter, more precise. The voice she associated with moments when things started moving in directions nobody had planned. "Equipment case is hardened transit for electronics, not tools." "Agreed." "Relay base will tell you it's a misdirected crew. Happens at decommissioned facilities." "Is that what you think?" A beat. "No, if it feels staged, it is." She kept watching. They reached the fuel depot perimeter and disappeared through a service door that should have been locked. She marked the time. 17:14. She kept watching. At 17:31, she put the drone up. A small ISR quad, positioned on the Pad 1 service catwalk for exactly this contingency. She flew it low and slow along the fuel depot's eastern wall, using the building mast to mask the rotor's noise. The feed was grainy in the heat shimmer, but readable. The service door the two figures had entered. A second door further along the wall, standing open 6 inches. Heat signatures inside, more than 2 bodies. At least 4, maybe 5, the thermal imaging struggling through the concrete. She was pulling the drone back around when it happened. A single, sharp crack from the direction of the north runway. The drone lurched hard right. The feed went static. She was already moving, dropping below the window level, pressing her back to the wall beside the frame. Heart rate ticking up. Then she brought it back down deliberately. 1 breath, 2. That was a rifle shot. Subsonic, suppressed, from the north. She'd registered the bullet impact on the drone's frame before hearing the muted bark of the suppressor. That told her distance, 600 meters minimum, possibly more. The shooter had been waiting for the drone, had identified it as ISR, and neutralized it before it could image whatever was happening in that depot. That was not opportunistic behavior. She got back on her rifle, swept north, slow and methodical. Runway, service road, the old radar tower array on the north end, 4 towers, 2 standing, 1 listing badly, 1 collapsed. Movement on Tower 2, not much. A shadow that shifted once, then went still. Exactly the kind of stillness an untrained eye reads as nothing and a trained eye reads as deliberate. She spent 45 seconds on that tower. The shadow didn't move again, but she had seen it, and the shadow had known the exact threshold of stillness required to disappear. Her mouth was dry. This wasn't a hired security element protecting an intel crew. This was a counter-sniper. She didn't call Donovan immediately. 60 seconds to organize before putting anything into words. Words created records, and records created narratives. And she wasn't sure yet whose narrative this was. What she knew, a team of at least 4 had accessed the fuel depot through a secured entrance, carrying electronics transit hardware. They'd pre-positioned a counter-sniper on the north radar tower before arrival, which meant they'd been planning this for at least 24 hours. The counter-sniper had waited specifically for drone ISR activity before engaging. They understood her surveillance methodology. They had studied her. The coldness that moved through her wasn't fear. It was more precise than fear, the specific recognition of being inside someone else's plan. She keyed the tactical radio. Overwatch actual to relay base. Hostile sniper on Tower 2, North Array. Drone is down. Request immediate. The radio went to static. Not signal degradation. The flat, wall of sound static of a dedicated jammer. She pulled out the satellite phone. Donovan picked up before the first ring finished. I see the jammer's signature. It came up 40 seconds ago. Emily. He only used her first name when he was prioritizing. The relay's uplink just dropped to 61%. Someone is in the system. Team in the fuel depot, at least 4 bodies. She was already running contingencies. Counter sniper on Tower 2 covering their exfil window. I can't raise relay base. Relay base is in the same jammer zone. They're blind. She looked north. The radar tower. The shadow. I need to relocate. If they've studied my position, they have. The shot on the drone was not a guess. They knew exactly where you were flying from. Her jaw tightened. How long have they been watching? That, he said carefully, is what worries me. A pause. Emily, the Route 93 convoy. 2100, I know. That's 3 hours away. If they fully compromise the relay, I know. She began breaking down her position. Nothing left behind. I'm moving to secondary. Keep the satellite line open. I'll be here. She shouldered her pack, lifted the Mark 22, and moved to the stairwell. Through the empty window frame behind her, the desert stretched flat and indifferent. The radar tower stood dark against the reddening sky. Something patient was watching her go. Secondary position was a maintenance catwalk on the west face of the control tower. She'd identified it on day one as her fallback. Lower, less coverage, but positioned behind a steel ventilation cowling that would mask her silhouette from the north. She settled in, rebuilt her position. Shooting bag, bipod, dope card clipped to the stock. The data sheet compiled over 9 days. At this facility, in afternoon thermals, a 10 miles per hour crosswind pushed around 0.8 mils at 800 meters. She had it memorized, but she kept the card anyway. Donovan had taught her that. Write it down. Memory fails at the worst time. The card doesn't. She got on her scope. Tower 2 was 610 meters from this position. Different angle. The shadow was gone, which meant the counter-sniper had also relocated. Expected. A good sniper move once compromise was possible. She swept the entire north array. All 4 towers, the connecting walkways, the collapsed rubble of Tower 4, the shadow pools at each base. Nothing, which told her plenty. This counter-sniper moved without leaving visual signature, anticipated her relocation. That caliber of fieldcraft wasn't organic. It was trained to a specific high standard. She thought about what Donovan had said. They've studied her. She shifted to the relay terminal building, a squat, reinforced concrete structure on the eastern edge, added in 2021 when the Army realized Helios's infrastructure wasn't permanent. No exterior activity. All doors appeared closed. But the uplink was at 61% and falling. She keyed the phone. Donovan, relay uplink. 58. They're moving fast. I need eyes on the terminal building. Can you push the east-facing camera? Trying. The jammer's degrading my remote access. Maybe 30 seconds of clean feed. Do it. The image came through compressed, slightly artifacted but usable. East face of the relay terminal. Service door, closed. But at the door's base, a thin cable running from the door frame to a junction box on the exterior wall. New. Not in any of her facility survey photos. A bypass cable. Someone had hardwired external access directly into the relay's physical infrastructure. This wasn't remote intrusion. Someone had physically connected hardware to the system. You see the cable? Donovan asked. I see it. This isn't a remote hack. They're inside the terminal. Which means the team in the fuel depot was a diversion. She let that land. 4 bodies in the fuel depot, visible, carrying equipment cases. Drawing her attention, drawing her drone, letting the counter-sniper establish her position and surveillance method. While a separate team, quieter, faster, smaller, went straight for the terminal. She'd been managing the wrong threat. Emily, I'm thinking. Think out loud. 2 elements. One makes noise, one makes entry. Counter-sniper keeps me reactive instead of active. She exhaled slowly. This is professional. This is not opportunistic. No, Donovan said. It isn't. A gust hit hard enough to rock the ventilation cowling. She compensated without thinking, noting the direction, updating her wind model. There's something else, Donovan said. Before the jammer came up, I found a recurring transmission pattern in the 36 hours prior. Encrypted but structured, like a relay handshake, like someone was negotiating a data transfer protocol with the terminal. A buyer, she said, or a recipient, someone positioned to receive whatever gets rerouted. She stared at the terminal building. Who has the access codes to initiate a handshake with a hardened Army relay terminal? Donovan was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the question that worries me. The warning shot came at 1803. She felt it before she processed it. A pressure displacement against her left cheek. A slight sting of displaced air. Then the sound catching up. a subsonic crack, muted, from somewhere in the north array. The round had passed within 4 inches of her head. She was flat behind the ventilation cowling before conscious thought engaged. Heart slamming, she gave herself 3 seconds. Let the adrenaline peak and begin recession. 4 inches. At 600+ meters, in variable crosswind, putting a round within 4 inches of a target required extraordinary marksmanship. She didn't believe this was accidental. It was a message. I have you. I've had you. I am choosing not to end this. She pressed against the catwalk railing and processed what that meant. A kill shot would have been easier. A kill shot would have removed the only asset capable of defending the relay. The warning meant the counter-sniper wanted her reactive, not dead. Head down, focused on her own survival instead of the terminal operation. Smart. She keyed the phone. Shot fired. Warning, not lethal. I'm compromised at secondary. I heard the impact on the cowling. Donovan's voice was careful. You hit? Negative. Moving to tertiary. She'd built a tertiary on day 3, almost a formality. Now she was glad of the habit. North crawl space under the level 1 mechanical room. Below grade facing northeast. They can't get a downward angle from the tower array. That limits your sight lines. I know. Limits theirs too. She was already moving. Donovan, this sniper, the shot was perfect. The restraint was deliberate. I know. Who trains to that standard and then pulls the shot? The answer came without hesitation. Someone who has a reason to want you alive, or someone who has orders that don't include killing American military personnel. She stopped in the stairwell. American military personnel. Say that again. Think about who has access codes for a hardened Army relay terminal. Think about the transmission handshake. Think about why a professional operation has a counter-sniper who is very carefully not killing the Overwatch asset. She thought about it. She thought about the relay's uplink percentage dropping steadily, about the kind of data that ran through that terminal, about who could negotiate access to Army infrastructure. This isn't a foreign operation, she said slowly. Donovan said nothing, which was answer enough. She moved down the stairs, fast and silent, toward the tertiary position. Behind her and above, somewhere in the failing Nevada light, the counter-sniper tracked her movement through the building's shadow, patient as weather, waiting for the next phase to begin. The crawl space smelled like rust in old insulation. Emily pressed herself flat against the concrete floor, the Mark 22 cradled across her forearms, and breathed through her nose. The tertiary position ran beneath the level 1 mechanical room, a narrow gap between the building's foundation slab and the utility conduit network, accessible through a maintenance hatch she'd padlocked from the inside on day 2. The ceiling was 40 inches above the floor. She couldn't sit up. She couldn't pace. She could shoot. The northeast-facing aperture was a ventilation gap in the foundation block, approximately 8 inches tall and 14 wide, cut to allow airflow under the mechanical room. From outside, it looked like nothing. From inside, with her rifle bipod collapsed to its lowest setting and her cheek pressed to the stock at an angle that would leave her neck aching for a week, it gave her a sightline across the northeast quadrant of the facility, including the base of the North Radar Tower array. She got on her scope and began the work of rebuilding her picture. The array was 580 meters from her current position. Closer than before, and lower, she was shooting upward at a slight angle rather than downward, which changed her ballistic corrections. She updated her dope mentally. At 580 meters with a 12 miles per hour crosswind, now shifting to northwest, she was looking at 0.6 mils of windage correction, slightly less if the gusts dropped in the next 20 minutes. The thermals were settling as the sun fell. That was in her favor. She swept the towers one by one. Tower 1, clear. The base access door stood open, which was how she'd found it. Tower 2. She spent 90 seconds on every level, every shadow, every angle of the cross-member structure. Nothing visible. Tower 3, listing 18 degrees, access ladder gone, structurally unusable. Tower 4, collapsed rubble. Nothing could be hiding in it that she couldn't eventually see. She extended her sweep to the access road running along the north fence line and stopped. A vehicle she hadn't seen before, parked just outside the perimeter fence on the service road. A gray panel van, no markings, backed into the shadow of a berm that lined the road. From her previous positions, it would have been invisible, shielded by the building mass of Hangar A. From here, at this angle, she could see its rear quarter. Engine off, no exhaust heat rising from the tailpipe, but the rear doors had been opened and not fully closed. A gap of 4-5 inches. She stared at it. A stationary exfil vehicle positioned outside the perimeter, which meant whatever was happening inside the facility was designed to conclude, and the team inside planned to walk out through the north fence line rather than the way they'd come in. Either the north fence had already been breached, or they had the tools to breach it on the way out. She keyed the satellite phone. Donovan, here. Exfil vehicle, service road, north fence, parked behind the eastern berm. Gray panel van. I can see partial rear doors from my current position. They're planning to walk out through the north. A pause. Keyboard sounds. I don't have camera coverage on that road. The north perimeter cameras were part of the Helios security system. They went offline when the jammer came up. Of course they did. She kept her scope on the van. Donovan, the relay uplink. 44%. She did the math. At this rate of decline, full compromise in approximately 19 minutes. The civilian convoy on Route 93 wasn't the only concern. At 40% uplink capacity, the GPS subnet serving 4 states would begin showing degraded accuracy. Below 30%, it would start failing intermittently. The kind of failures that sent aircraft slightly off course, that caused automated systems to make incorrect calculations, that were individually small and collectively catastrophic. I need to know what's in the relay terminal, she said. Not the hack, the data. What are they actually getting? I've been trying to trace the reroute path. A pause, longer than his usual pauses. Emily, the reroute isn't going to a foreign endpoint. I know. It's routing to a domestic IP block. Commercial. I cross-referenced the block allocation. His voice shifted in a way she recognized. The shift that happened when Donovan was looking at something that confirmed a fear he'd already been carrying. It's registered to a subsidiary of Helios Dynamics. The silence between them held for a moment. They never really let go of this facility, she said. No, they mothballed it. But the relay terminal, the Army added that in 2021. Helios didn't own that infrastructure. So how does Helios have the access handshake credentials for an Army-hardened terminal? She already knew the answer. She'd known it since the stairwell, when Donovan had pointed at the question without saying it directly. Someone inside the Army had sold them the credentials, or given them. I'm pulling the registered entities for that IP block, Donovan said. The subsidiary is called Orbital Meridian Solutions. I've never heard of it. I have, she said quietly. She had heard the name exactly once, 3 months ago, in a briefing room at Peterson Space Force Base. A procurement officer had mentioned it in passing, a contractor under consideration for the next generation GPS augmentation program. A contract worth, if the numbers on the whiteboard had been accurate, approximately $4 billion over 7 years. To win that contract, a company would need to demonstrate capability with the existing GPS architecture. Or they would need the existing architecture's data to be compromised enough that a new system looked necessary. Donovan, she said, this isn't a hack, it's a demonstration. Say that again. They're not stealing the data, they're degrading the relay's performance on purpose, making the current system look unreliable, creating the case for a replacement contract. she exhaled slowly. And if the civilian convoy on Route 93 gets lost in the desert tonight because the GPS failed, that's not collateral damage. That's evidence. That's a news story. That's congressional testimony. The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. Jesus, Donovan said. She thought about the last time she had felt this particular kind of cold clarity. Fort Bragg, 2 years ago. A training exercise that had gone wrong in the way training exercises sometimes went wrong. Not through incompetence, but through the collision of two sets of correct assumptions that happened to be incompatible with each other. She had been running an overwatch position on a mock objective when the aggressor element had done something her training told her they wouldn't do. Something outside the doctrinal parameters. Something that required her to make a decision her training hadn't prepared her for. She had frozen for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in that context would have been fatal. Afterward, Donovan had sat with her in the debrief room long after everyone else had left. He hadn't told her she'd done anything wrong. He hadn't run through the tactical correction. He had poured 2 cups of terrible coffee from the machine in the hallway and set one in front of her and said, "The freeze isn't the problem. The freeze is your brain catching up to a reality it wasn't expecting. The problem is if you let the freeze become the decision." She had asked him what you did instead. "You name it," he said. "Whatever the new reality is, you name it out loud to yourself. Not in your head, out loud, even if it's a whisper. The act of naming it breaks the freeze. Your brain thinks in language. Give it the language." She named it now, quietly, her lips moving without sound in the crawlspace dark. Someone inside the Army's own procurement chain sold access to a hardened military relay terminal to a private defense contractor. That contractor used the access to degrade GPS infrastructure serving 4 states. They positioned a corporate security element and a trained counter-sniper to prevent interference. They planned to use civilian navigation failures as evidence in a contract bid worth $4 billion. She let the sentence sit in the air. It did not become more comprehensible for having been spoken, but it broke the freeze. She pressed her back against the crawlspace wall and ran through the inventory of what she still had. 9 days on this ground. She had walked every accessible structure in the facility during her first 3 days, before settling into the overwatch routine. She had done it the way Donovan had trained her, not with a purpose in mind, but with the specific intention of having no purpose, of allowing the ground to show her what it contained without the filter of a predetermined objective. She had measured distances by pacing. She had noted sight lines from positions she had no intention of using. She had cataloged access points, structural conditions, lines of concealment, areas of dead ground that thermal optics could not penetrate. She had done all of this because Donovan had told her once, in the specific context of extended surveillance operations, that the ground was always giving you information, and the only question was whether you were listening. Most operators listen for what they expected to hear. The useful information was almost always in what you didn't expect. She had not expected any of this, but she had the ground. She thought about the North Array, Tower 2, where she'd first identified the counter-sniper. Tower 2 was 580 meters from her current position and had 3 viable shooting platforms. The base level, the mid-level cross-member structure at approximately 40 feet, and the upper platform at 65 feet. She had spent time on all 3 during her facility survey. The upper platform gave the best sight lines, but was structurally compromised. 2 of the 4 corner supports had corroded through, and the platform shifted perceptibly under body weight. The mid-level crossmember was solid, but offered limited coverage of the western structures. The base level had full coverage of the western structures, but poor elevation for long-range work. A counter-sniper operating at 600-plus meters, demonstrating the level of marksmanship she had already witnessed, would not choose the base level, would tolerate the structural compromise of the upper platform only if the mid-level cross-member's coverage limitations made it unacceptable. She had been moving, she realized, in exactly the pattern that would make her visible from the upper platform on Tower 2. East to west, staying low but crossing open ground at predictable intervals. She had been assuming the counter-sniper was tracking her by behavioral prediction, modeling where she would go next. What if they were simply watching? What if the counter-sniper had been on Tower 2 the entire time? She thought about the warning shots. The first from the north, consistent with Tower 2. The second from the catwalk, also from the direction of the north array. Both consistent with a single, static position on Tower 2's upper platform. A static position. A good sniper moved when compromise was possible. The counter-sniper had demonstrated they understood when to move, had vanished from Tower 2's observable structure after she'd identified the shadow. But what if the movement had been a minimal adjustment, not a full position change? What if the counter-sniper had relocated within Tower 2 rather than abandoning it? 9 days of ground knowledge told her that the upper platform of Tower 2 had a blind spot on its western face. A structural support column on the northwest corner, combined with the remnants of a partially torn windscreen, created a dead zone approximately 4 meters wide at the platform's western edge. From her previous positions, the control tower, the catwalk, that dead zone had been irrelevant. But from the storage building's subfloor, looking northeast at an upward angle, that dead zone was potentially in her sightline. She filed that. She also thought about what it meant if the counter-sniper was running a static position. Static meant commitment. Static meant a deliberate choice to remain in a known location despite the compromise risk, which meant either they were confident the position was secure enough to hold, or they had a reason to stay in that specific location that outweighed the tactical cost of mobility. A reason to stay. The operations design, the depot diversion, the counter-sniper holding overwatch, the terminal team completing the reroute. The counter-sniper's job was to keep her occupied, reactive, unable to threaten the terminal operation. That job required coverage of the terminal building and the open ground approaches to it. Tower 2 provided exactly that coverage. Moving would sacrifice it. The counter-sniper was staying because the job wasn't done yet. The warning shots had not been random. Head proximity first, then shoulder proximity. Closer the second time, not further. In the communication system she was now certain they were using, that escalation pattern had a specific meaning. It meant, I am running out of options that don't end this badly. Not a threat, a statement of constraints. She needed to not become a genuine threat to the terminal operation. She needed to become a threat to something else entirely. She went through the subfloor gap and began moving toward the utility conduit. The jammer changed frequency. She felt it in her earpiece first. A slight shift in the static tone, a half step higher, like a tuning fork being replaced with a slightly different one. Then the satellite phone connection began breaking up. Losing you. The jammer just, frequency hop. Can you? I'm here, say again. Uplink is at 39. I'm losing remote. A burst of static. Then the line went clean for 2 seconds. Emily, I lost camera access to the terminal building. I'm blind on my end. Copy. She kept her voice level. I have eyes on the north array and the exfil vehicle. You focus on the reroute path. If you can get any kind of signal through to relay base, I'll keep trying. The line dropped. She lay still in the subfloor of the storage building for 6 minutes after Donovan's line dropped. 6 minutes was a long time. Long enough for the terminal team to advance their work by several percentage points. Long enough for the counter-sniper to identify her next probable move and position accordingly. Long enough for her to talk herself into or out of almost anything. She used the time to take inventory. Mark 22 Model 0, suppressed, with a Night Force ATACR 5-25x56 scope. She had 4 magazines remaining, 20 rounds each, 80 rounds total, loaded with .300 Norma Magnum match-grade AMAX. She had a backup Glock 19 with 3 magazines. She had a fixed blade knife, a tourniquet, 2 field dressings, a compression bandage, and a blowout kit that she hoped she would not need. She had water for approximately 6 hours. She had no comms except the satellite phone, which was intermittently functional, and no air support, no QRF, no medevac within a response time that mattered. She had 9 days of ground knowledge and a mind trained to find angles that other people's minds move past without seeing. She thought about angles. The counter sniper knew her first 3 positions. Primary in the control tower, level 3 ops booth. Secondary on the level 2 catwalk. Tertiary in the crawl space beneath the mechanical room. 3 positions was enough to establish a pattern, not a rigid pattern because she varied her selection criteria, but enough to understand her methodology. She chose elevated positions when she needed coverage range, ground level positions when she needed concealment. She prioritized northeast exposure because the radar tower array was northeast. The counter sniper knew all of that, which meant the counter sniper was currently covering the positions that fit her methodology. The elevated northeast-facing positions, the approaches to the relay terminal, the sight lines toward the tower array. She needed to be somewhere the counter sniper hadn't modeled. She thought about the storage building's subfloor, the gap in the foundation blockwork she'd found on day 4, the connection to the equipment building's crawl space. She thought about the utility conduit she'd noted on day 6, during a perimeter walk she'd done out of restlessness as much as methodology. A maintenance conduit running underground from the storage building's west access point to the south wall of Hangar C, large enough to crawl through, 40 meters. She had noted it as a fact with no immediate application. Today was the day it had application. She pocketed the satellite phone and began moving. East through the crawl space to the far end, the subfloor gap. Through it, on her side, Mark 22 leading, into the storage building's foundation space. Old pipe runs, the smell of oil and decades of trapped heat. She belly crawled west, counting body lengths in the dark. The conduit hatch was where she'd noted it, a floor-level access panel in the westernmost section of the storage building's subfloor, rusted but operational, its handle yielding after she applied pressure with both hands and her full body weight. It opened onto a narrow maintenance conduit that smelled of standing water and old concrete and something organic she didn't examine too closely. She went in head first, dragging the rifle alongside her. The conduit was completely dark. She navigated by feel and count, measuring distance in body lengths, keeping the rifle muzzle elevated. At 31 body lengths, her hand found a vertical junction. She felt around it, 2 directions. Left took her further east, toward the facility's central service corridor. Right took her toward Hangar C's west wall. She went right. 12 more body lengths, another vertical surface, a handle. She turned it and pushed. The hatch opened into Hangar C's west utility bay, a narrow service corridor running along the hangar's western wall, electrical and mechanical access. Strip lights overhead, half dead, the rest giving off dim yellow glow that after the absolute dark of the conduit seemed almost bright. She lay still for 30 seconds listening. No footsteps, no voices. The hangar was empty. She could tell by the echo quality, the way sound moved without the damping effect of people or equipment. The space was vast and hollow, and the wind from outside made the metal roof structure tick and groan. She stood, checked herself, no injuries, rifle clear, and found the roof access ladder on the north wall. The roof of Hangar C was everything she'd calculated it would be. She moved to the northeast corner and set up behind the ventilation ridge, using it as a natural rest for her bipod. The ridge was corrugated steel, warm from the day's heat, humming faintly in the building wind. She checked the time, 2003 hours, 57 minutes to the convoy window. She got on her scope. North fence line, 80 meters. She could see the breach point immediately, a section of chain link that had been cut and folded back, cut ends still bright where the wire had been freshly snipped. A gap approximately 4 feet wide. The gray panel van was visible through it on the service road, rear doors still showing their gap. A figure was standing beside the van. She tracked onto him. Male. Tactical clothing, same nondescript pattern as the depot team. Facing away from her, looking north down the service road, serving as road watch while the rest of the element completed their work inside. One man outside. At minimum, 4 still inside the terminal. She moved her scope to the relay terminal exterior. Both doors closed. The bypass cable still running up the west wall. No movement at the windows. Narrow, clear-story windows near the roofline, light visible behind them. Interior lighting, which meant they had power running in there. Then her satellite phone vibrated. A text message, pushing through on a burst transmission that the jammer's frequency cycle had momentarily missed. One line from Donovan. Uplink at 22%. Reroute almost complete. Demonstration not theft. They want the failure on record. She read it twice. Below her, inside the terminal, they were in the final phase. She thought about the convoy, 16 vehicles on Route 93. Private contractors mostly, heading to Tonopah. People who had planned their night around getting there, who had no idea that the GPS signals guiding them across the Nevada dark were being systematically degraded by a corporate entity that needed a news story to justify a contract bid. She thought about what Relay Alpha's full failure would look like. Not just Route 93, military aircraft navigation across the Southwest, automated approach systems at 4 regional airports, the safety margins that pilots and ground controllers relied on without thinking about them, the way you relied on the floor being there when you stepped. She thought about what stopping it would require, and she thought about Donovan in Afghanistan, in the particular kind of conversation that only happened when everyone was too tired to maintain the usual emotional distance. The hardest part of this job isn't the shot, he had said. The shot is physics. The hardest part is living inside the gap between what you're ordered to do and what you know is right. Most people never close that gap. They just learn to stop noticing it. She had asked him what the alternative was. He had been quiet for a moment. You close it, he said. Every time you see it, you close it, even when it costs you something. She moved her scope back to the fence line in the figure by the van. He was no longer looking north. He was looking directly at Hangar C. She didn't move. Motion triggered the eye faster than shape or color. She kept her crosshairs steady and watched him watch the hangar. He hadn't pinpointed her. His gaze was scanning the roofline generally, not locked onto her position. He'd seen something, or heard something, or felt the change in the air that experienced operators felt when a situation shifted. She regulated her breathing. He keyed a radio at his shoulder, spoke briefly. She couldn't hear the words. Then he resumed his road watch position, facing north. But his body language had changed. The casual stance was gone. His weight had shifted forward, and his right hand had moved to his sidearm without completing the draw. He'd reported her, or reported a suspicion. She had perhaps 4 minutes before someone came to investigate. She thought about the warning shots. There had been 2 now. The first at secondary position, 4 inches from her head, a message delivered at 600 meters through variable wind. The second, earlier at the catwalk, also a near miss, also non-lethal, also deliberate. The pattern was not random. Head proximity, shoulder proximity, both non-lethal, both at distances and in conditions where a kill shot would have been geometrically simpler. She had known snipers who used warning shots as a communication system, a language of proximity and restraint that conveyed intent without words. It was a technique with roots in the scout sniper community, used in certain contexts during close-in stalking exercises where radio comms were prohibited. You didn't talk, you signaled with placement. Headshot that missed. I have full solution. I am choosing not to take it. Shoulder shot that missed. I am still watching. Time is running out. Consider your options. She had been taught this system. She had taught it to others. The counter sniper was using it, which meant the counter sniper had the same training she had. She thought about that carefully. The system she was describing wasn't in any public doctrine. It wasn't in any published manual. It was passed instructor to student in specific schools, in specific units, in specific contexts. The population of people who knew it and used it fluently was not large. She thought about Donovan's words from Scene 7. Someone who has orders that don't include killing American military personnel. She thought about who gave those orders. Not Helios Dynamics, not Orbital Meridian Solutions. A corporation running a contract fraud operation gave its hired operators the minimum rules of engagement necessary to complete the mission. You didn't give a contractor consideration for the legal and moral implications of killing a U.S. soldier unless someone with genuine military knowledge and authority had been involved in structuring the operation from the beginning. The same someone who had sold the relay terminal's access credentials. Her jaw tightened. She pressed it back down. Anger narrowed focus in the wrong direction, inward toward the grievance rather than outward toward the solution. She cataloged it. It would still be there later. She keyed her phone one more time and sent Donovan a single line. Counter sniper using Scout communication protocol. Same school as me. Look at this from the inside. She sent it and pulled back from the ridgeline, staying flat on the roof. 4 minutes. She needed to do something decisive or get off the roof. Not both. She looked at the relay terminal, then at the breach in the fence, then at the panel van. Then she did something Donovan had taught her in a rain-soaked field at Fort Bragg 3 years ago, when she was still a private first class who thought tactical problems had single correct solutions. Stop solving the problem they gave you, he'd said. Find the problem underneath it. The problem they had given her. Stop the data transfer before the relay's GPS function was destroyed. The problem underneath it? The people running this operation needed the failure to be visible, documented, attributable to the relay's inadequacy, rather than to deliberate sabotage. They needed the story to be the system failed rather than we broke it, which meant the one thing they absolutely could not afford was for the deliberate nature of the sabotage to become visible, for the attack to be provably an attack, not a failure. She thought about that. She reached for her satellite phone. She typed fast, keeping her head below the ridgeline. The reroute log. Can you capture it? Full packet trace, time-stamped. Send to your Army contact right now, not through normal channels. 20 seconds. Donovan. Already running. Sending to General Hartwell at Space and Missile Defense Direct. He's outside the normal chain. She exhaled. Good. Now I need you to tell me exactly where the structural weak point is on the relay terminal's roof. A longer pause. Then, you're thinking about the penthouse. Yes. I looked at the facility schematics when you first mentioned the terminal. The penthouse mechanical enclosure sits on a raised platform on the east end. Single steel support column, 4-inch hollow structural steel, with a conduit run carrying the antenna feed across the column cap. She had seen the penthouse in her facility survey photographs. She had noted it as she noted everything, without immediate application, filed away. She was retrieving it now. The column itself is too heavy for your rifle to penetrate, Donovan continued. But the conduit fitting at the base, the connection point where the antenna cables terminate on the column cap, that's weathered aluminum, maybe 3 inches of target profile. If you destroy that fitting, the antenna loses its ground plane. Uplink drops to 0. How fast? Instantaneous. The transfer would terminate mid-packet. Incomplete. Not a system failure, a severed connection. That's a very different thing for the packet trace to show. She ran the geometry. The terminal's east face, the penthouse, the conduit fitting. From her current position on Hangar C's roof, The east face of the terminal was approximately 240 meters northeast. The angle was workable. The target was small, 3 inches of aluminum against a steel column, but it was stationary, lit by the terminal's exterior floodlights, and she had been reading this wind for 9 days. Wind, she typed. 14 miles per hour northwest right now, shifting in direction every 4 to 6 minutes. Lull cycles approximately 6 seconds each. She already knew the lull cycles. She had watched this wind all afternoon. She thought about the first time Donovan had put her on a precision shot under genuine pressure. Not a training evolution, not a range qualification. A real operation. Her second deployment, a mountain pass in eastern Afghanistan, where the wind came off the peaks in patterns that she had been told were unreadable, and that she had spent 4 days learning to read anyway. She had been 24 years old, lying in a shallow scrape in frozen ground for 9 hours, and her spotter had been telling her the shot was outside acceptable parameters. She had been listening to the wind and calculating and recalculating, and the spotter had been right by every standard metric and wrong by the specific knowledge she had built in 4 days on that particular ground. She had taken the shot. Donovan had debriefed her afterward. Not about the result. The result had been what it needed to be. About the decision. About the moment between the spotter's assessment and her trigger press, when she had chosen her own read over the metric. What did you know that the metric didn't? He had asked. She had thought about it carefully. The metric used a standard wind formula based on observed flag movement at the firing position and a standard deviation table for mountain thermals. What she had known was that the flag at her firing position sat inside a micro-terrain dead zone, a local wind shadow created by a boulder formation that didn't register on any map. The actual wind at mid-range was different. She had watched debris moving at mid-range for 4 days and built a picture that the metric couldn't contain. You trusted the specific over the general, Donovan had said. That's the whole job. Every rule we teach you is a general rule. Every shot you take is specific. The day you stop knowing the difference is the day the rifle becomes a liability. She had thought about that conversation many times over 3 years. At 240 meters on this rooftop, in this wind, the general rule said the shot was marginal. A 3-inch target in shifting conditions, compromised shooting position on a vibrating metal roof, low light. The general rule said wait for better conditions or don't take the shot at all. The specific said she had been reading this wind for 9 days. She knew the lull cycle interval down to the second. She knew the way the wind accelerated through the gap between Hangar B and the terminal building and decelerated as it hit the terminal's south face, creating a predictable reduction in effective crosswind at her shooting position in the 2 seconds before the lull registered on the fence flag. The specific said she had a window of approximately 1.8 seconds after the flag dropped in which the effective crosswind at the bullet's path was under 3 miles per hour. 1.8 seconds. One shot. She settled behind the bipod, cheek welded to the stock, and began the final wind read. I can make the shot, she typed. Donovan's response took 10 seconds. I know you can, but Emily, after you take it, you are fully exposed on that roofline. The counter sniper will have your position in under 30 seconds. I know. And then? She put the phone in her pocket. She moved to the northeast corner of the roof, behind the base of a ventilation stack that gave her both concealment and a stable shooting platform. She extended the bipod to full length and set up on the raised lip of the roof parapet, bringing the scope under the terminal's east face. She found the penthouse, the antenna array, the conduit run, the target, a 3-inch aluminum conduit fitting where the antenna cables terminated at the penthouse base, resting on a channel steel support across the column cap. Weathered, brittle at the connection joints from years of thermal cycling in the Nevada heat. She settled her breathing. The light was gone now, fully. She switched to the illuminated reticle, fine red crosshair, no bloom in low light. The terminal's exterior floodlights threw the penthouse into sharp relief, light from below casting an upward shadow across the column. She could see the fitting clearly. She set her crosshairs on it and began her wind read. The flag on the north fence line, northwest, steady right now. The dust on the tarmac surface, moving in a single consistent direction without cross eddies. The corrugated steel ridge beneath her, vibrating at a frequency that told her the wind speed before she consciously processed it. She watched the flag through her scope, timing the lull cycles. 4 minutes and 12 seconds since she'd set up. 3 full cycles observed. Gusts at 14, 12, 15 miles per hour. Lulls between them lasting 5 to 7 seconds. In the lull, the wind dropped to 3 or 4 miles per hour. She could work with 3 miles per hour. At 240 meters, a 3 miles per hour crosswind pushed around approximately 0.15 mils. She dialed the correction. She put the crosshairs on the fitting and held, watching the flag at the periphery of her scope's field of view. The flag moved, gusting. She waited. It dropped. She pressed. The Mark 22 barked, sharp, controlled, the suppressor cutting its signature by 30 decibels. She was already calling the shot through the scope, tracking the impact. The round hit the channel steel 6 inches left of the fitting. She worked the bolt, chambered her second round. The flag was still slack. She had 3, maybe 4 seconds. She adjusted, 6 inches right, crosshairs on the fitting itself. The aluminum, the connection joint, the precise point where the ground plane met the cable run. She pressed. The fitting exploded. Not dramatically, a shatter of aluminum, a spray of small fragments caught in the floodlight's beam, and then the antenna array above it, tilting slightly as its ground connection was severed. The cable runs went slack at one end. The antenna leaned at 5 degrees and stayed there. Her phone vibrated immediately. Donovan. Uplink just dropped to 0. Reroute terminated mid-transfer. Incomplete packet log time-stamped 2027 hours. Transfer cut off at 67% completion. Then, 2 seconds later, it worked. She exhaled. Then from the north, running feet, the fence line, the exfil team moving. And from somewhere in the middle distance, from the radar tower array, a single shot. Subsonic, suppressed. It hit the parapet 10 inches from her right shoulder. The counter-sniper had found her. She rolled left, off the parapet and flat on the roof. The Mark 22 pulled tight against her body. Not a kill shot. Still not a kill shot. 10 inches was close enough to be a warning at this range. But with the marksmanship this counter-sniper had demonstrated all evening, 10 inches was a deliberate choice. It was not a miss. It was a message, same as the others had been. She pressed her back to the ventilation stack and let her heart rate settle. The exfil was moving. She could hear it clearly now. Boot sounds at the fence breach, the gravel of the service road, the panel van's rear doors opening fully. The terminal team was extracting. From Helios's operational perspective, the mission was complete. They'd achieved significant relay degradation. The incomplete transfer at 67% might still be enough to create the failure record they needed, depending on how Donovan's packet trace played out with Hartwell. That was no longer her problem to solve. She had a different problem. She lay on the roof and thought about what she knew. The counter-sniper had been tracking her all evening and had chosen, at every juncture, not to kill her. Had used a communication protocol that required specific military training. Had, according to every available indicator, not been running a purely corporate mission. And now, with the exfil team clearing the fence below, with the operation functionally concluded, the counter-sniper had stayed. That fact sat at the center of everything. She thought about orbital meridian solutions. The Peterson Space Force Base briefing 3 months ago. The 12 people in that room. She could reconstruct the list from memory. It was a habit she developed in her first deployment and never abandoned. Always build a list. Always know who was in the room. The briefing officer. 3 colonels from Space and Missile Defense Command, 2 civilian analysts from DIA, a procurement officer, a contractor representative she hadn't been introduced to, and 1 flag officer she had been introduced to, briefly, in the hallway outside the briefing room, whose name she had registered and filed. Brigadier General Alan Morrow. She had not thought about Morrow since that day. He was one of dozens of flag officers she'd been in the same room with over her career, present at the edges of operations she was too junior to have full visibility into. Visible, but not salient. He was now extremely salient. Because Brigadier General Alan Morrow was, according to the last organizational chart she had reviewed at Peterson, the senior officer responsible for the GPS augmentation procurement process. He was the person who would receive the congressional testimony about GPS failures. He was the person who would evaluate the competing bids. He was the person who, if the current infrastructure was sufficiently discredited, would recommend Orbital Meridian Solutions' replacement system. And he was the person with the authority and access to transfer relay terminal credentials to a private contractor. She thought about the counter-sniper's rules of engagement. Do not kill American military personnel. That instruction required knowledge of what you were dealing with. Knowledge that the asset at Artemis facility was military, not civilian. Knowledge that derived from the operational planning stage, not from field observation. It was an instruction written by someone who understood the specific legal and moral landscape of what they were doing. Who had decided at the planning stage that there was a line they would not cross? A flag officer's line. She pulled out her satellite phone. She typed a message and sent it to Donovan with a simple instruction. Route this to any active comm channel still open inside this facility. The message was 4 words. Same reason you did. She set the phone face down on the rooftop and waited. The sandstorm that had been building all evening was arriving now. She could feel it before she could see it. A pressure drop, a shift in the wind's texture from gritty to dense, fine particulate beginning to sting the back of her neck and the exposed skin of her wrists. The stars to the west had disappeared behind a wall of suspended dust that was moving fast and low. She had perhaps 20 minutes before visibility dropped below 100 meters. 20 minutes. Her phone vibrated. Not Donovan's number. An unknown number. 1 message, 4 words. Same reason you did. She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. Then she stood up, checked her rifle, and moved to the roof access hatch. The interior of Hangar C was dark except for the pale emergency lighting along the floor-level strip, a row of dim orange rectangles running the length of the hangar's west wall. She came down the ladder fast and moved away from it immediately, putting distance between herself and the only fixed point the counter-sniper might associate with her descent. She went to the center of the hangar floor and stopped. The space was immense. Both main hangar doors stood partially open at the south end, leaving a gap of 10 feet through which the rising wind was now driving dust in a steady curtain. The sound of it was enormous, a low, continuous roar against the metal structure, punctuated by the deeper groan of the building's frame absorbing the pressure. Any sound she made at normal volume would be swallowed by it. Any shot fired in here would echo off the steel walls in ways that made direction impossible to determine. She thought about that. She moved to the east wall and took up a position behind a row of old equipment carts, metal frames on wheels that had been pushed against the wall and abandoned. She had cover, sightline to the main floor, and 2 exit options, the floor hatch to the conduit behind her and the north personnel door to her right. She waited. The north personnel door opened 60 seconds later. She had her rifle up before the figure was fully through the door, sighting plane, trigger finger indexed, both eyes open the way she'd been trained. The figure moved the way trained people moved, low, controlled, weight distributed, head on a continuous, slow swivel. Not rushing, not fumbling. The figure stopped. She could see the silhouette against the dust-diffused light from the door. Compact, her height, roughly, carrying a suppressed rifle in a similar configuration to her own, dressed in the same nondescript tactical clothing as the corporate security element, but moving with a fundamentally different quality, an economy of motion that said this was not someone who had been trained to guard a building. This was someone who had been trained to find people in the dark. A sniper. The figure had seen her. Not her exact position, but the zone. The head was oriented correctly. The body had stopped with a slight sideways cant that maximized cover while maintaining mobility. They stood in the dark hangar with the storm roaring against the walls and looked at each other through the space between them. Emily made a decision. She angled the Mark 22's muzzle downward, not dropping it, not surrendering it, but rotating it 20 degrees off the horizontal. A gesture that anyone with training would read correctly. Not shooting. Not yet. The figure mirrored it. The same 20-degree angle. The same stillness. Emily said, "Morrow." Not a question. The figure was quiet for a moment. Then, "You got there faster than I expected." The voice was female, mid-30s, Emily estimated. The accent was flat, Midwestern, the kind of neutrality that came from long practice at not sounding like anywhere specific. "You stayed," Emily said. "The job wasn't finished. The exfil team is gone. The transfer is terminated. What's left?" "The evidence," the woman said. "The complete evidence, not just Donovan's packet trace." A pause. "Morrow is careful. He runs cutouts. Orbital meridian is 3 shells deep. The packet trace gets you to the 3rd shell and stops. You need the credential chain, the actual transfer of terminal access codes from Army infrastructure to Helios. That's a document, paper and digital both. It exists in Morrow's operational files, which are not in any system Donovan can reach from Tonopah." Emily absorbed this. "Where are they?" "Peterson." And here, the figure reached into a chest pocket with her left hand, slowly, deliberately, the right hand remaining on the rifle, and produced a small hard drive, black, the size of a thick playing card. Copy of the credential transfer documentation. Chain of custody from Morrow's aide to Helios's procurement liaison. Dates, authentication codes, the whole thread. "You were inside." "I was inside." Emily looked at her. "Who sent you?" The woman set the hard drive on the concrete floor and slid it 3 feet toward Emily. "Someone who is not going to be able to ask you directly. Someone who understood what was about to happen and couldn't stop it through the chain because the chain is compromised." "Hartwell," Emily said. The woman said nothing, which was answer enough. Emily thought about the packet trace Donovan was already routing to General Hartwell at Space and Missile Defense. She thought about a general officer who had identified what Morrow was doing and had chosen an operational response that could not be traced back through any official channel. Who had sent a counter-sniper with orders that reflected his own moral calculation? Complete the evidence gathering, protect the infrastructure if possible, and under no circumstances kill American military personnel. The same reason you did. The storm hit the hangar doors fully then, a deep structural concussion of sound as the dust front arrived, driving through the gap and filling the hangar with a swirling brown haze that reduced visibility to 30 feet. Emily reached down and picked up the hard drive without taking her eyes off the figure. "The exfil team," she said. "They're going to complete their extraction and disappear. Donovan has the plate. The van is registered to a logistics company in Henderson that is also a shell. It takes you to the 2nd shell, not the 3rd. But with what's on that drive?" The figure moved toward the south hangar doors. "You don't need the van." "I need a name," Emily said. "Your name, for the chain of custody on the drive." The woman stopped at the edge of the dust curtain. "Rourke," she said. "W. Rourke. Tell Hartwell the documentation is authenticated." Then she walked into the storm. Emily stood alone in the center of the hangar floor for 30 seconds. The dust swirled around her. The building groaned. The orange emergency strip lights threw shadows that moved and reformed with every gust that came through the south doors. She looked at the hard drive in her hand. She thought about what it represented. Not just the credential transfer documentation, not just Morrow's exposure. The hard drive represented the specific point at which an operation that had been designed to be deniable, structured through shells and cutouts, and a corruption so deep it had reached flag officer level, became undeniable. The point at which the story stopped being the system failed and became, this is what was done, and by whom, and why. She thought about the convoy on Route 93. They were 40 minutes from the GPS coverage zone now. The relay uplink was at 0. Her shot had cut the antenna ground plane, terminated the reroute mid-transfer. But 0 wasn't the same as restored. The relay would need assessment and repair before it resumed normal function, which meant the convoy would navigate that stretch of Route 93 tonight on whatever backup systems they had. She pulled out her satellite phone. Donovan picked up before the first ring completed. "I've been trying to reach you for 12 minutes. Are you?" "I'm fine. Listen." She kept her voice level. "The packet trace you sent to Hartwell. He needs to know there's a physical documentation chain coming through a source identified as W. Rourke. Tell him the authentication is confirmed. Tell him the credential transfer documentation covers the full chain from Morrow's operational files." A pause. "Morrow. Yes. Emily." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was managing something larger than the immediate tactical picture. "Are you certain?" "I'm holding the evidence." Silence for 3 seconds. "Route 93 convoy." "I know. Can you reach Nevada DOT on any channel? Get them a traffic advisory for that stretch. Recommend reduced speed, hazard lights, manual navigation until the relay is assessed. You don't need to explain why." "I can do that." "Do it now, then get Hartwell on the line." She moved toward the north personnel door. "The counter sniper is gone. Exfil team is mobile on the service road. Van, north on Route 375, Henderson registration. Corporate security, not military. Donovan. Nobody on our side of this is dead. Thank God for that." "Don't thank God yet." She pushed open the north door and walked into the storm. "We still have to explain what happened here." "What did happen here?" She thought about that for a moment, walking through the brown dark, the grit driving against the left side of her face, the rifle against her shoulder, and the hard drive in her chest pocket. "Someone built a trap," she said, "and it didn't close." She ended the call. The storm pressed against her. 50 feet ahead, the control tower was a darker mass in the brown dark. She walked toward it, head down against the wind, and thought about what came next. The debrief she would have to give, the report she would have to write, the chain of events she would need to reconstruct in language precise enough to be actionable and honest enough to survive scrutiny. She thought about Morrow sitting in his office at Peterson right now, reviewing the night's operational feed, believing the demonstration had been close enough to successful. She thought about the moment he would find out it hadn't been. She thought about W. Rourke walking somewhere in this storm on her own vector, having completed a mission that would never appear in any official record, and having done it for the same reason Emily had done her own. Not because it was ordered, not because it was safe, not because the chain of command had pointed at it and said, "This is the right thing," because the gap was there, and the gap required closing. She reached the control tower and pushed through the base-level door into the sudden silence of the interior. The storm muffled now to a low roar, the dust settling in the beam of her weapon light as she moved through the space she'd spent 9 days in. Her satellite phone vibrated. "Donovan, Nevada, DOT advisory is out. Hartwell is online. He wants to talk to you directly." She looked at the phone, then she keyed the call. The control tower base smelled like concrete dust and old wiring insulation. Emily pushed through the door and let it close behind her, and the storm became a sound rather than a physical thing. Still enormous, still present, but muffled enough that she could think clearly again. She stood in the ground floor corridor, weapon light on, and gave herself 30 seconds before she keyed Hartwell's line. She used the 30 seconds to reconstruct the full picture. What Hartwell had, Donovan's packet trace, time-stamped, showing the reroute attempt and its termination at 67% completion. A source identification, W. Rourke, attached to a physical documentation chain that covered the credential transfer from Morrow's operational files to Helios Dynamics' procurement arm. A hard drive, currently in Emily's chest pocket, that she had accepted from an operator who had been running a parallel mission she had not known about, and whose existence would require a significant amount of careful explanation. What Hartwell didn't have, Emily's account, which was, in the chain of evidence, the connective tissue between all the other pieces. She was the Overwatch asset who had been on the ground for 9 days. She was the person who had terminated the reroute by destroying the relay terminal's uplink antenna. She was the person who had been in the hangar when Rourke had handed over the drive. She was the witness. She keyed the call. General Hartwell's voice was not what she had expected. She had met Hartwell exactly once, briefly, at a Space and Missile Defense Command briefing 18 months ago. In that context, he had been the ambient authority in the room, the person whose presence reorganized everyone else's posture without him doing anything in particular. His voice on the phone was different, flatter, more precise. The voice of someone who had been managing a crisis in silence for long enough that the silence had become its own kind of weight. Staff Sergeant Carter, "Sir, I understand you have the Rourke documentation." "Yes, sir. Physical drive. Chain of custody confirmed by the source." "Where are you now?" "Control tower, Artemis facility. I'm secure. The exfil element cleared the north fence approximately 18 minutes ago. The counter-sniper has withdrawn. There are no additional hostile elements on the grounds to my knowledge." "To your knowledge," Hartwell said, not questioning it, acknowledging the qualifier. "Donovan tells me the relay uplink is down. I severed the antenna ground plane. The reroute was terminated mid-transfer at 67% completion. I can give you the shot time and position for the maintenance record." "I'll need that." A pause. "Staff Sergeant, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Sir, when you terminated the reroute, did you have authorization from your chain of command?" She considered the question. Not the answer. She knew the answer. She was considering the full weight of it, the legal and professional architecture it sat inside. The fact that the honest answer to this question was the first of several honest answers that were going to make the next weeks of her life considerably more complicated. "No, sir," she said. "My chain of command was offline. The jammer had taken down the tactical radio net. I made the call independently based on my assessment of the operational situation." "And your assessment was?" "That the mission as originally briefed, protect the relay from unauthorized access, had been compromised at its source, that the relay was being used as a weapon against its own function, and that preventing the attack from completing was more consistent with the mission's actual purpose than protecting the infrastructure at the cost of letting the attack succeed." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "That is a very precise way of describing insubordination," he said. "Yes, sir. It is also," he said, "a correct assessment of the situation." She waited. "The exfil element, Donovan has the plate?" "He has the plate. The van is registered to a Henderson Logistics Company, which I'm told is a shell. The documentation on the drive should give you the thread from Orbital Meridian Solutions, through the subsidiary structure to Helios Dynamics, and from there to General Morrow's operational files." The names sat on the line between them for a moment. "Morrow," Hartwell said. "Just the name. The way you said a name when you had been carrying it for a long time and had finally said it out loud to someone who had the authority to act on it." "Yes, sir." I'm going to need you to stay on that ground until I can get an assessment team to you. That will be approximately 4 hours given the storm. Can you hold? I can hold. Good. Another pause. The sound of him making decisions she couldn't see. Staff Sergeant Carter, what you did tonight, the how and the why of it, is going to require a significant amount of institutional processing. There will be an investigation. There will be a formal review of your independent action. I want you to understand that clearly. I understand that, sir. I also want you to understand something else. His voice shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but less formal. The voice of a person speaking rather than an officer commanding. The convoy on Route 93 is currently navigating that stretch at reduced speed with manual protocols because Donovan reached Nevada DOT 40 minutes ago. 16 vehicles. All of them are going to arrive at their destination tonight. She held the phone and listened to the storm outside. Thank you for telling me that, sir. 4 hours, Hartwell said. Stay in the tower, stay off the net. And Staff Sergeant, good work. The line clicked off. She stood in the ground floor corridor for a moment, listening to the building around her absorb the storm. Then she started up the stairs. She went back to the Level 3 operations booth, her original position, the place she'd spent 9 days building a picture of this facility, this mission, this particular piece of the world. The window frame was still empty. She'd removed the glass herself on day one, and the storm was driving fine grit through it in horizontal sheets that caught in her weapon light and moved like something alive. She set the Mark 22 against the wall and sat on the equipment case she'd been using as a chair and looked out through the empty frame at the Nevada dark. She couldn't see more than 20 feet. The facility had become entirely abstract in the storm. She could feel its mass in geometry, in the way the wind behaved differently depending on which direction it came from. Could feel the mass of the hangars deflecting the gusts. Could feel the open channels of the runways in the undisturbed howl that came from the south. But she couldn't see any of it. The ground she had spent 9 days learning was invisible. She thought that was probably appropriate. She pulled the hard drive out of her chest pocket and looked at it. A rectangle of black aluminum, roughly the size of a thick playing card, with a standard connection port on one end and nothing else. No markings, no identifying labels, nothing that would distinguish it from any other portable storage device. It contained, according to Rourke, the credential transfer documentation that linked Morrow's operational files to Helios Dynamics' procurement arm. The chain of custody that Donovan's packet trace alone couldn't reach. She thought about what it had taken to produce this drive. Someone, Rourke, operating under Hartwell's direction through channels that didn't officially exist, had been inside the operation. Inside Helios's planning structure, or inside Morrow's staff, or both, for long enough to acquire and copy documentation that was buried 3 shells deep in a corporate structure designed specifically to prevent it from being found. They had then positioned themselves at Artemis facility under the cover of the counter-sniper role Helios had hired them to fill, and waited for an opportunity to transfer the drive to someone on the right side of this. They had waited for Emily. She turned the drive over in her hands. She thought about the 4 words Rourke had sent via text. Same reason you did. She had read it as confirmation of shared motivation. 2 people arriving at the same conclusion through different paths, constrained by different circumstances, making the same choice. The choice to close the gap, in the language Donovan used, even when it costs you something. For Emily, the cost was the investigation Hartwell had described, the formal review of her independent action, the institutional processing of a decision she had made without authorization in a situation where the authorization structure had been corrupted at the source. She was not naive about what that meant. She had been in the Army long enough to understand that the rightness of a decision and its institutional legibility were not always the same thing. For Rourke, the cost was different. Rourke had been operating undercover for however long it had taken to acquire that documentation. Weeks, possibly months, in a corporate structure connected to a flag officer who had the access and motivation to make problems disappear. The moment Rourke had handed over the drive and identified herself, even with a name that might or might not be her real one, she had exited the operation permanently. Whatever cover she had been using was burned. Whatever access she had built was gone. She had given up her position to give Emily the drive. Emily set it back in her chest pocket and buttoned the flap. Outside, the storm roared. She picked up her rifle, not to shoot, just to have it in her hands. The familiar weight of it, the specific geometry that she had learned so completely that holding it required no conscious attention. She held it across her knees and looked at the empty window frame and thought about the things she would have to say in the debrief. She would have to explain the independent action, the decision to destroy the relay terminal's uplink antenna rather than defend it. She would have to reconstruct the logic chain that had led her from the mission as briefed to the mission as she understood it at the moment of the shot. And she would have to do it in language that was honest without being naive, precise without being defensive, and clear without being arrogant about a decision that had consequences she hadn't fully controlled. She would have to explain Rourke, the meeting in the hangar, the drive, the text exchange, the fact that she had accepted physical evidence from an unknown operative working an unauthorized parallel mission and had incorporated that evidence into a chain of custody she was now presenting to a three-star general as reliable. She would have to explain why she believed Rourke. She thought about that. The honest answer was not forensic. She didn't have independent verification of the drive's contents. She didn't have documentation of Rourke's bona fides. She had the text message, "Same reason you did," and the warning shots that had told her, in a language only people with specific training could read, that the person on the other end of the rifle understood what mattered and had chosen to protect it. She had read the person and trusted the read. That was the honest answer. Whether it was an institutionally satisfying answer was a different question, and not one she could resolve tonight in a storm on the third floor of an abandoned control tower. She set the rifle against the wall again and sat back on the equipment case. 4 hours. She had been awake for 19 hours. She was not going to sleep, but she could rest. The specific discipline of stillness that was not sleep. The managed pause that let the body recover some of what it had spent without the vulnerability of unconsciousness. She had learned it on her first deployment in a hide site in the mountains where sleeping was not an option, and yet 6 hours of absolute stillness had left her more functional than the exhaustion had suggested was possible. She closed her eyes. She listened to the storm work itself against the building. She thought without particular urgency about everything she didn't know. She didn't know who Rourke was, in any durable sense. She didn't know how far the corruption extended beyond Morrow, whether he had acted alone or with the knowledge and complicity of others in the procurement structure. She didn't know what would happen to the $4 billion contract bid when the credential transfer documentation became visible, or how Helios Dynamics would respond, or how many lawyers would be involved in making what had happened tonight into something that could be adjudicated rather than buried. She didn't know what would happen to her. She thought that last thought without particular weight. She had made the decision she'd made. She had closed the gap. The consequences were the consequences, and worrying about them now served no function she hadn't already served. The wind shifted. She could feel it in the way the grit came through the window, the angle changing, the horizontal drive becoming something more vertical, which meant the front was passing. In an hour, maybe less, the storm would break. The air would clear. The facility would re-emerge from the dust in the pale light before dawn, and it would look exactly as it had looked 9 days ago when she had arrived. Abandoned, sun-bleached, a place that was supposed to matter and then didn't. Except that tonight, it had mattered. In a specific, quiet, almost invisible way that would never appear in any public account of anything, it had mattered enormously. She sat with that. An hour before dawn, the storm broke. It went the way desert storms went, not gradually but all at once, the front passing like a door closing, and then the air was clear and cold, and absolutely still in the specific way the desert was still after weather, the absence of wind as total as its presence had been. Emily opened her eyes. She stood up, stretched the particular stiffness of 3 hours of managed stillness out of her shoulders and neck, picked up the Mark 22, and moved to the empty window frame. The facility was there again. The hangars, enormous and dark. The launch pads, their gantry structures skeletal against the pre-dawn sky. The radar tower array, Tower 2 still standing with its compromised upper platform. No visible light or movement anywhere on it. The relay terminal building, squat and reinforced, its east penthouse visible even at this distance. She could see the tilted antenna array, the loose cable runs that she had severed 12 hours ago. Or 6 hours ago. She had lost precise track. She looked at the north fence line. The breach was invisible at this distance and in this light, but she knew where it was. She looked at the service road beyond it, the berm where the gray panel van had parked. Nothing there now. Clean. She keyed her satellite phone. Donovan picked up on the first ring. "Storm cleared," he said, before she could speak. He'd been watching weather feeds from Tonopah, she realized. He'd known when it would break. "Storm cleared," she confirmed. "All quiet on the ground. No movement since the exfil team cleared at approximately 2010 hours. Assessment team is 90 minutes out. Army helicopter, 2 CID investigators, and a technical team for the relay terminal." A pause. Hartwell authorized the full package. "Good." Emily, she recognized the particular quality of that pause. She had been waiting for it, in the way you waited for something you knew was coming, without knowing exactly what form it would take. "Say it," she said. "The investigation is going to be thorough. Hartwell told me directly, he is going to protect what you did, but he cannot protect you from the process. You're going to have to go through the process. I know that. You made an unauthorized, independent action that destroyed Army infrastructure. The fact that the infrastructure was being used against its own purpose doesn't make that classification go away. It will be in the findings. I know. I want to make sure you actually know, not theoretically know, actually know." She looked out the empty window frame at the facility she'd spent 9 days on. The hangars, the towers, the relay terminal with its severed antenna. "Jack," she said. She rarely used his first name. He went still on the line in a way she could feel across the satellite connection. "I made the right call. I would make it again. I understand what that means for the process, and I'm prepared to go through it." A pause. "And I know that you know all of that already, and you called because you needed to hear me say it." A long silence. "Yeah," he said. "I did. I'm okay. I know you're okay." Another pause, and in it she could hear everything he wasn't saying. The 14 months of working together, the 9 days of being her only connection to anything outside this facility, the specific and somewhat unreasonable concern that a man who had survived 2 wars and a truck bomb in Kandahar had apparently developed for the operational welfare of a 29-year-old sniper who had told him she was fine approximately 40 times in the last week. 90 minutes, he said. "I'll be with the assessment team." "You don't have to." "I'm going to be with the assessment team," he said, in the tone that meant the sentence was complete. She looked at the eastern horizon. The sky was beginning to differentiate, not light yet, but the precise shade of dark blue that preceded light, the color that meant the night had made its decision. 90 minutes, she said. She clicked off and stood at the empty window and watched the horizon and thought about the things that would happen next and the things that wouldn't, and the particular shape of the silence that followed an operation that had gone the way this one had gone. Not cleanly, not according to the brief, not without cost, but correctly. In the specific sense of correctly that she had no better word for than the one Donovan used. Closed. The Army helicopter came in from the east, low and fast, using the cleared runway that she'd directed them to via satellite text. She stood on the tarmac in the pre-dawn cold and watched it flare and settle, the rotor wash driving a new curtain of fine grit that she turned her back to and waited out. 6 people emerged, 2 in civilian clothes that said CID as clearly as a badge, 3 in technical gear with equipment cases, and Donovan in civilian contractor kit, moving with a slight, careful quality that his left knee had developed in the last year. A thing he never mentioned and she never raised, and both of them pretended wasn't there. He walked up to her and stopped, looked at her the way he looked at things he was assessing, completely and briefly and without the performance of looking. "You're thinner," he said. 9 days of MREs. You need to eat actual food." "I'm aware." He nodded once, the assessment complete. Then he handed her a paper bag. She looked inside. A breakfast sandwich, wrapped in foil, still warm. She looked back up at him. "I had the helicopter stop at a gas station," he said, entirely without embarrassment. She ate half of it while the CID investigators introduced themselves and began their preliminary questions, which she answered with the complete and specific accuracy she had been composing in her head for the last 3 hours. She kept the other half of the sandwich in her hand. It helped, having something to hold. The lead CID investigator was a woman named Vasquez, approximately 40, with the patient and slightly exhausted demeanor of someone who had interviewed a great many people who had done things that required investigation, and had learned that most of those people were more complicated than the incident reports suggested. "Staff Sergeant Carter," Vasquez said, "I'd like to start with the moment you made the decision to engage the relay terminal's antenna infrastructure. Walk me through your reasoning in real time, as best you can reconstruct it." Emily walked her through it. She started with the relay's uplink percentage falling, with the jammer taking down her tactical radio net, with Donovan's identification of the reroute destination and his conclusion, which she had independently reached, that this was a demonstration attack rather than a theft. She walked through the decision tree, defend the terminal as ordered, which was no longer possible without addressing the terminal team, destroy the relay directly, which would accomplish the attack's purpose for it, or find the third option, which was to interrupt the reroute mid-transfer in a way that preserved the evidence of the attack rather than eliminating it. She explained the conduit fitting, the geometry, the wind. She explained the 2 shots, the miss and the correction. She laid it out precisely and without editorializing. And when she was done, Vasquez looked at her for a moment and then made a note on her pad and said, "And the decision to make that call independently, without authorization from your chain of command, how do you characterize that decision in retrospect?" Emily thought about what Donovan had said on the phone. The investigation is going to be thorough. She thought about Hartwell's precise language. That is a very precise way of describing insubordination. She thought about the 16 vehicles on Route 93 that had arrived at their destinations. "I characterize it as the right call made in the absence of authorization that couldn't be reestablished in the available time," she said. "I understand that characterization doesn't resolve the institutional question of whether I had the authority to make it. I'm prepared to have that question examined thoroughly." Vasquez made another note. "The Rourke documentation," she said. "Tell me about the handoff." Emily told her about the handoff. She was precise about what she had observed, what had been said, what she had concluded, and where the gaps were in her knowledge. She did not speculate beyond the evidence. She did not describe the forward text exchange as proof of anything beyond a shared tactical communication protocol that indicated specific training. She presented it as what it was: data that she had assessed and trusted based on a read of the person, and that Hartwell's team would need to independently verify. When she was done, Vasquez closed her notebook and said, "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. We'll need several more hours of your time today. But for now, is there anything you need?" Emily looked at the hard drive in her hand, which she had been holding since the beginning of the interview. She held it out. Vasquez took it. "No," Emily said. "I think that's everything." The technical team spent 4 hours on the relay terminal. Emily sat on the tailgate of a support vehicle that had come in with the second helicopter, a larger one arriving 2 hours after the first, and drank coffee from a thermos someone had handed her and watched the sun come up over the Nevada desert. It was remarkable, the sunrise. She had seen it every morning for 9 days from the Level 3 ops booth, where the elevation gave it scale, but from the tarmac it was different, closer somehow, the light arriving at a more human height, the shadow of the hangars retreating across the desert floor in a way that felt less like illumination and more like revelation. The kind of word she didn't normally use and would not have said out loud, but which was the accurate word for the specific quality of light at 0617 hours in the Nevada desert after a night that had been what this night had been. Donovan came and sat beside her on the tailgate. He poured himself coffee from the same thermos without asking. She handed it to him before he could reach for it. They sat for a while without talking. "The assessment team found the second bypass cable," he said eventually. "The thick one you identified. They're calling it a passive data tap. It was pulling copies of the relay's internal traffic logs in addition to the reroute. The reroute was the demonstration. The traffic logs were the product. Even at 67% transfer completion, they have approximately 90 days of internal relay diagnostics that will read, to anyone who looks at them without knowing what they're looking at, like a system in chronic degradation." She absorbed that. "Manufactured evidence of systemic failure," she said, "going back 3 months, predating the actual probe activity by 6 weeks. He drank his coffee. "Which means they've been building this for longer than we knew. The access wasn't recent. The tap was probably installed during the facility's mothballing period, which means either Helios put it there before they handed the keys back, or someone with access to the facility during that period did it for them." "Morrow's aide," she said, remembering what Rourke had said. "Chain of custody from Morrow's aide to Helios's procurement liaison. That's Hartwell's read, too." A pause. "The aide has been placed on administrative hold pending the investigation. Morrow," he stopped. "Morrow," she said. "Morrow resigned his commission at 0400 this morning. Medical reasons," the official notification said. Donovan's voice was even. "Which is the institutional equivalent of—" "I know what it's equivalent to," she said. He nodded. She thought about Morrow in his office at Peterson, reviewing the night's operational feed, believing the demonstration had been close enough to successful. She thought about the moment he had found out it hadn't been, that the transfer was incomplete, that Hartwell had been contacted, that the evidence chain was intact and moving. She thought about what that moment must have felt like, and then she stopped thinking about it because it wasn't useful and she didn't have the energy for it. "The contract bid," she said, "Orbital Meridian. Suspended pending review. The procurement process is being reopened with new oversight." He paused. "The existing GPS infrastructure, Relay Alpha included, has been provisionally validated as operationally sound. The 90 days of fabricated diagnostic data will be excluded from any performance assessment." She nodded. They sat with that for a moment. "Did you know?" she asked. Not accusingly, just wanting to know. "That Hartwell had a parallel operation running?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected something was wrong above the level of the operation as briefed. The access codes. The level of operational sophistication. I raised it through my own channels 3 days before you deployed. I don't know what happened with that." "Hartwell happened with it," she said. "Probably." He finished his coffee. "He's a careful man." "So is Morrow." "Was," Donovan said. She looked at the relay terminal building. The technical team was still inside. The tilted antenna array was visible on the penthouse, the severed conduit fitting still showing its raw aluminum edge where her round had taken it apart. 2 shots, a miss and a correction. She thought about the specific geometry of the correction, the 6-inch adjustment, the wind lull, the 1.8-second window that her 9 days of ground knowledge had given her. She thought about the Fort Bragg field in the rain, and the specific over the general, and the fact that all the training and all the knowledge and all the 9 days of watching this particular wind ultimately came down to one moment of trust in her own read of a situation that had no precedent in anything she had been taught. She thought about what it cost to close the gap. It cost this: an investigation, a formal review, an institutional accounting of a decision made without authorization, in a situation where the authorization structure had failed. It cost the specific and somewhat unwelcome knowledge that doing the right thing and doing the authorized thing were not always the same thing, and that a person who intended to live with integrity in an institution that was sometimes corrupt had to be prepared to carry the weight of that difference. It cost the thing you gave up when you stopped pretending the gap wasn't there. She could live with that. She had, in fact, been living with it her whole career. She had simply not been required to act on it at this scale before. Donovan stood up from the tailgate and stretched his left knee carefully, the way he did when he thought no one was watching. She was watching. "Vasquez wants another hour of your time when you're ready," he said. "Tell her 20 minutes. He nodded and walked toward the investigator's position. She sat on the tailgate and finished her coffee and watched the technical team move in and out of the relay terminal and thought about nothing in particular for 19 minutes, which was the closest thing to rest she had managed in 26 hours. Then she stood up and went to find Vasquez. 3 days later, she was back at Peterson Space Force Base. The debrief had taken most of 2 days, not because the facts were unclear, but because the institutional machinery required to process what had happened was extensive and slow-moving and involved a great many people asking the same questions from slightly different angles to ensure that the answers remained consistent. They had. She had made the record precise and complete and had answered every question put to her with the same accuracy she would have brought to a range qualification or a sector sketch, without embellishment, without minimization, without the specific kind of selective memory that was technically not lying, but was not quite honest either. She was precise because that was the only way she knew how to be. The formal review board had been convened and then suspended pending the investigation's completion, which Hartwell had told her, in a conversation that was, nominally, not happening, would take approximately 60 days. In those 60 days she was on administrative status, which meant she was in limbo, which meant she had nothing to do except wait and think. She was sitting in the waiting room outside Hartwell's office when the door opened and Donovan came out. She looked at him. He sat down in the chair beside her. "He wants to see you," he said. "I know. He had me scheduled." She looked at the door. "How was it?" "He asked me whether your independent action reflected a pattern of behavior or a situational response to a specific set of circumstances." A pause. "I told him it reflected the kind of judgment that develops in a person who has been trained well and who has been paying attention." "That's not an answer to his question." "No," he said, "it isn't." She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, the way he looked when he was thinking about something larger than the immediate conversation. "What did he actually want to know?" she said. "Whether you can be trusted to operate in environments where the authorization structure is unreliable." He paused. "Which is, in practice, most of the environments that matter." She thought about that. "What's your answer?" He looked at her then, directly, the full assessment that he gave things he was taking seriously. "I think you already know my answer," he said. The door to Hartwell's office opened. His aide looked out and said, "Staff Sergeant Carter?" She stood up, picked up her cover from the chair beside her, ran a quick automatic check of her uniform the way she always did before entering a general officer's presence. She looked at Donovan. "Did you finish it?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment. "I finished what mattered," she said. She walked through the door. Hartwell's office was spare and functional in the way of career officers who had been in enough places to understand that the accumulation of objects was a liability. A desk, two flags, a single framed photograph on the far wall, too distant for her to make out the subject. A window looking out on the Peterson flight line, where an F-35 was taxiing in the early morning light. He was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came to attention and said, "At ease," before she had finished the motion, which told her something about how he intended the conversation to go. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said, "sit down." She sat. He sat across from her and placed a manila folder on the desk between them. He did not open it. "I'm going to tell you several things," he said. "Some of them are official and some of them are not, and I trust you to understand the difference." "Yes, sir." Officially, the formal review board's proceedings are suspended pending the completion of the CID investigation. Your administrative status will be resolved at the conclusion of that investigation. The timeline is 60 days. You will be given full opportunity to present your account. He paused. Unofficially, the review board will find in your favor. I am telling you this not because I am predetermining the outcome, but because the outcome, given the facts, is not in genuine question. What you did at Artemis facility was unauthorized. It was also correct. Both of those things are true simultaneously. And the institutional question of how to hold them simultaneously is what the next 60 days will be about. She waited. Officially, the Rourke documentation has been authenticated by CID and forwarded to the Department of Justice. The credential transfer chain is complete and actionable. General Morrow's resignation does not protect him from criminal liability, and the investigation into his activities and those of his aide is proceeding. Another pause. Unofficially, Morrow understood, when he resigned, what was coming. He chose the form of the damage he could control. He did not choose to fight it. He knew the drive existed, she said. He suspected something existed. He had been concerned about Rourke's operational reliability for several weeks before Artemis. Hartwell's expression was even. He was correct to be concerned. He was not correct about why. She thought about Rourke, walking into the storm, gone. Where is she now? "Rourke is not a subject I have information about," Hartwell said, in the specific tone that meant, "I have information about Rourke, but this is not the context in which I will share it." She accepted that. "The assignment," she said. "What happens to my assignment?" Hartwell opened the manila folder, turned it so she could see the document inside. An assignment order dated 3 days from now. She read it. The location was not Artemis facility. It was not anywhere she had been before. It was a different kind of installation, in a different kind of operational environment, with a different kind of mission brief, but the structure was recognizable. Long-range reconnaissance, Overwatch, a hardened communications node that required protection from threats that had not yet been fully characterized. At the bottom of the order, in the field for special instructions, someone had typed 4 words: "Trust your own judgment." She looked up at Hartwell. He was watching her with the specific expression of a man who had spent a career making decisions in the gap between what was authorized and what was right, and who had long since made his peace with the weight of it. "Questions?" he said. She looked at the order again, at the location, at the 4 words at the bottom. "No, sir," she said. She picked up the order. She stood, came to attention, and walked out of the room. In the hallway outside, Donovan was still sitting in the chair where she'd left him. He looked up when she came through the door. She handed him the assignment order without speaking. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in it settled. The particular quality of stillness that she had learned to read as satisfaction in a man who kept most of his reactions in places you couldn't easily see. He handed it back. "When do you leave?" he said. 3 days. He nodded. They walked down the hallway side by side, past the framed photographs of missions and units, and the institutional history of a command that had been built to operate in the high frontier and was still, imperfectly and expensively and sometimes corruptly, trying to do that. The light through the windows was flat morning light, the kind that showed everything without making anything look better than it was. She thought about Artemis facility, the 9 days, the wind she had learned to read, and the ground she had learned to trust. The facility would be assessed and repaired and returned to function. Relay Alpha restored, the antenna rebuilt, the bypass cables removed, the damage documented and corrected. It would resume its quiet, essential, invisible work of keeping aircraft on course and convoys navigated and the intricate machinery of modern movement running in the background of everything. Nobody would know. Nobody needed to know. She thought about W. Rourke, somewhere she couldn't see, having closed her own gap and paid her own cost and moved on. She thought about the 4 words at the bottom of the assignment order. She thought that they were, all things considered, the most useful briefing she had ever received. They reached the building's exit. Donovan pushed the door open and held it, and she walked through into the Peterson morning. The flight line, the taxiing aircraft, the flat Colorado light that was already warming toward the particular dry heat of a high-altitude desert day. She put on her cover. She had 3 days.